Buenas noches y bienvenidos al espectáculo de whisky irlandés El Shebeen. Soy Bartolomeo y esta noche vamos a hablar del Jerez, el vino más importante en el mundo de la producción de whisky irlandés. Esta noche me acompaña Lorena para discutir todo sobre el vino importante. Lorena, ¿cómo estás esta noche?
Hola Bartolomeo y hola mis amigos. Estoy muy bien, gracias. Y tengo muchas ganas de tomar un whisky irlandés y hablar de Jerez. Vamos.
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 We can do it all in Spanish. Let's do it all.
We'll draw the line there. There'll be a few Spanish words appearing and you'll hear a lovely pronunciation as we talk about sherry or Jerez. But we'll not do the whole thing.
If anybody would like to communicate solo en español, please. Por favor, vamos.
Great, we're getting comments. Greg says muy bien.
Welcome to the Shebeen in English. Tonight we are talking about the most important wine. This is World of Irish Whiskey, sherry. And I'm joined, of course, tonight by Lauren, who is going to help as we dive into the history, the production, the styles, and the contribution of sherry, Jerez in the world of Irish whiskey. So it's going to be a good night. It's going to be a multilingual night as we revert back and forth between Espanol and Inglés. I learned Spanish for 6 years, not that you'd know it. Lauren gave tours in Bushmills in Spanish. And so if you would like a Spanish tour of any whiskey distillery, everyone has a price. Everyone has a price.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's going to be a really interesting sort of deep dive into the world of sherry. It's such a complex wine. It's such a complex thing and part of the industry, I guess, to talk about. I've made so many notes because learning about sherry, reading a few articles, there's so much information. You just want to write things down to keep yourself right. So learned a lot in the last couple of days. And yeah, hopefully everyone enjoys.
We want this episode to be something that you can come back to, that you can reference, that you can, if you have some questions about sherry, that we will have answered them tonight. And that's something you can point to. I think there should be just one place where we can go in the world of Irish whiskey and find answers, and we're hoping this will be it. While there's a lot to cover, it's also, there's not that many styles of sherry, so we're able to kind of focus in and understand each of them and how they're used in the world of Irish whiskey. But it is a complicated history, geography, and process and how they're made. So we're going to break that down for you. It is an incredibly important topic for those of us who love fortified wine, contributed whiskies. And I know that our community in the United States have a particular a particular love for fortified wine, sherry, matured, port cask matured, Madeira, Malaga, Marsala. Fortified wines play a big role in the canon of the world of Irish whiskey in the United States. So we want to know how we arrived at those flavors, and we want to talk about how we got to where we are today, that sherry is a part of the world of Irish whiskey. And we're hopefully going to answer that for everybody tonight. Every time I dive into the world of Irish whiskey, no different than you did, Lauren, over the last few days, I learned something new. And having spent a week in Scotland last week, I think it's time to schedule a week in Jerez in the southwest of Spain to understand it a bit more. So that's next on the list. So maybe when the weather starts getting good in the spring, that's where I'll be headed. Before we get into sherry and all of its great qualities, we should be drinking something, I suppose. Do you have something in your glass, Lauren?
I do indeed. So I have 3 whiskies lined up for tonight. Again, I always try to keep within the theme of which we're talking about. So I have first of all, any whiskey busters joining us will be very familiar with this one. Our Whiskey Bus W.D. O'Connell exclusive 5-year whiskey, which was aged in a Fino cask, which is actually not very common, as we will talk about, to be used in the Irish whiskey industry. I also then have lined up the Sexton, which is an all sherry aged whiskey, Oloroso. And then I have Blackbush 8020, which is PX. So I've got a Fino, an Oloroso, and a PX. covered most bases. What about
That's
yourself?
great. I will start off with our own soon to be released in the next 24 hours WD O'Connell Amontillado cask, because we're going to talk about Amontillado sherry tonight. So I will be sipping on this one. I'll also be sipping on a drop of our Dunville's 19-year-old Stories and Sips, all Oloroso cask finish, 6 years in Oloroso casks. I've also got a Redbreast friend at hand Belfast all Oloroso sherry cask, aged Redbreast. And for an interesting story, I've got our Cliffs of Moher whiskey, because we aged our whiskeys in casks that came from Spain and were filled with a Spanish wine called Oloroso and Palo Cortado. However, they're not sherries because they came from outside of the sherry triangle. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more tonight as well. So there's lots there to sip on and talk about. But I'm going to start by pouring the W.D. O'Connell. There's been some new whiskey releases this week. And as we've been doing the last few weeks, we want to direct you to our outlet for new Irish whiskies, which is irishwhiskeywatch.com. There you'll find all details of the newest whiskies that are released each week. It's free to add your email address in there, and you'll get a notification every time there's a new email. They're coming thick and fast. We could spend the whole night talking about new Irish whiskies, but instead we'll add them here to irishwhiskeywatch.com. Hundreds of you have added your email address in there and get an email every time something new we get notifications of. And if we don't get notifications of it, it might slip beneath the radar. Somebody will tell us, and we'll try and add it in there later. Lauren, you were busy this last week. Some of us were working hard. You were drinking hard and traveling hard.
As you were slaving away on the floor of Irish Malts, getting matching bottle numbers for your upcoming release, I was in Galway drinking whiskey and stout. No, of course, I had other reasons to be in the city as well. Yeah, it was brilliant to be in Galway for the first time since 2019. So I hadn't been there since pre-COVID, and it was great to be back in the city. So, of course, our whiskey bus in March, from the 15th to the 22nd of March, is going west. We're going out to Ireland's Wild Atlantic Way, and we will be in Galway for 2 nights right after St. Patrick's Day. So we'll be there from the 18th to the 20th. So I was really down there to finalize a couple of moving pieces with certain distilleries. I'm sure many of you could hazard a guess. Certain distilleries, which I'll be revealing this week. So keep an eye on our socials, and a few Irish whiskey pubs there as well, to, as I said, pull together a few final bits for the itinerary for Whiskey Bus 3. There are still very, very small number of seats available now, which I actually can't believe, because it's a fantastic itinerary. And what I spoke about with certain distilleries, certain brands, and certain locations at the end of last week was just unbelievable. If you're not already on board, which a few of you are, I know a few of you in the comments are, the likes of Greg, I see Greg in the chat, you will want to be, trust me. When you see all those viral photos and videos popping up at the end of March, you'll wish you'd clicked that book now button. But I'll leave it there for now.
I mean, just to be clear, we're bringing a whiskey bus around Ireland on St. Patrick's week. We're going to be involved in a St. Patrick's Day parade. We're going to have exclusive access to a whiskey bonder on St. Patrick's Day. We're going to have exclusive access to distillery experiences, and we're going to be situated in the west of Ireland in Galway for 2 nights. For those who were on our last whiskey bus in Cork, they will have enjoyed derived great pleasure from being located right beside the Shelburne Bar in Cork. Imagine now being in Galway, where you're right beside 6 or 7 equally fantastic whiskey bars, all in the one within 5 minutes walking distance of our hotel. It's going to be amazing. I think we've got 2 or 3 seats left. That's it. I'd love to sell them out. I'm surprised they haven't. Could be the time of the year. But if any of you know any friends who want to join us, send them to irishwhiskeyexperiences.com. We really want to get as many people to enjoy what's going to be a fantastic, fantastic week in Ireland in March.
Amazing. Yeah, so we're staying in the Hardiman Hotel, which is just right on Eyre Square in the city centre. Sonny Malloy's is less than a 5-minute walk. O'Connell's whiskey bar is literally, you can see it from the front of the hotel. It's so close, and it's a phenomenal bar. And I visited O'Connell's, and those guys are more than happy to kind of have us as their make that our resident watering hole, whiskey watering hole for the few nights we're there. It will be fantastic.
I lived in Galway for a few years, and I absolutely fell in love with the city. It would be maybe after Belfast, it'd be Cork, Belfast, then Galway would be my favorite cities in Ireland. And really, really love it. And it's just so walkable. Many of you have been there already, but yeah, it's going to be great. And you're going to be hearing more about this in the next few days and weeks as well. So when those seats go, they go. And when it's sold out, it's sold out. So if you're on the fence at all, give us a shout. We can work with you to help you figure out transportation to and from Ireland, and point you in the right direction, help you navigate airports to come in and out of, hotels to stay before or after. We're at the end of a phone. We're at the end of email. We'd love to help you. And we know it can be a little bit tricky trying to figure it out. But if you want to join us and you're on the fence, talk to us. We'll figure it out together. All right. We're moving on from Irish Whiskey Experiences. Before we get on to Sherry, I want to notify you give you 24 hours notice of what is happening tomorrow. Stories and Sips Whiskey Club. We've got a fantastic release tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern. 2 whiskies from W.D. O'Connell. I have them here. A 2 5-year-old, a pair of pot stills, 2 5-year-old pot stills. One has been finished in an Amontillado sherry cask, which you'll be hearing a lot more about in 5 minutes. And the other has been finished in a cask that previously contained the first ever peated single malt, triple distilled peated single malt released in Ireland in 100 years. Bill Phil from W.D. O'Connell. These are 2 extraordinary whiskies that belie their age, and I'm thrilled to get them in front of you. I sat down with them on Saturday. I sat down with them again this afternoon, and I am so happy that we've chosen these whiskies. I will be buying up as many of these as I can myself, because I really love them. 2 very different whiskies that show what can happen in 2 different casks with the same distillate. The whiskies were recast the week that we started our whiskey club 2 years ago. So they spent 2 years in Amontillado and 2 years in a peat cask. If you want the tasting notes, if you want all the details, you'll find them on in our whiskey or on our Facebook group and on storiesandships.com. Anyway, those go live tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern. Really excited that they're going out there. And the bundle where you get the 2 whiskeys and all the swag, stickers and glass toppers and coasters and whiskey samples and glassware. Great deal. This release is the part of the proceeds are going to raise money for charity. So we're hoping to raise $3,000 to be able to give to Cork Penny Dinners. $5 from each bottle will go directly to Cork Penny Dinners, and we will be auctioning off bottle number 1 of each of these. Here's bottle number 1 of each of these. They're in my safekeeping. And in the next couple of months, not this auction, but the following auction with Irish Whiskey Auctions, they will be auctioned. So that's the hope. $3,000 for Cork Penny Dinners. Everyone getting a great whiskey, and us supporting independent whiskey makers along the way is a win. And that's it. So looking forward to that. Greg says it's closer to 20 hours. You're right. 20 hours, yeah, to go, not 24. And so, yeah, 3 p.m. Eastern. So keep an eye out for that, folks. If you're part of our club, it's not too late to join. Go to storiesandships.com. You can join our club and get access to these great whiskies as well. All right. What is next? Oh, yeah, there's another picture of our lovely whiskies, and I think that's it there.
Should have thrown the one in of you slaving away on the floor.
Listen, I have to tell you now, right? So I had no intention of matching the bottle numbers, but somebody said, are you going to match the bottle numbers? And I said, well, I hadn't thought about it. And they said, well, it'll help my OCD. And I said, okay, well, we'll do that. What I hadn't realized was that we were going to receive a pallet of 580 bottles or 560 bottles, where each one of the cases had 6 random bottle numbers inside it. So I took out 560 bottles. I laid them out on the floor, and I tried to match them as best I could so I could label the cases. Whew. It took me 4.5 hours, and I still wasn't finished. So we had to leave the rest of it for Irish malts. But yeah, you will get matching bottle numbers when you order a bundle. So do not ask me for a certain number. You're not going to get that. Don't say, Barry, I want number 37. Not going to happen. But you will get matching numbers. If you want to order you're fine.
I did see that comment. Someone was like, I think it was actually Richard, was like, can I have the same bottle of number of my whiskey bus bottling? And I could just see from up north, I could see the steam coming out of your ears. Like, I'm not doing that.
I have had people messaging me saying, "Can you find this bottle number? Can you find that bottle number?" It's impossible. Like it's not something we can fulfill, unfortunately. Just the resources, it's not. We are we're a very small volume customer of Lighthouse Drinks, parent company of Irish Malls, and they're doing us many favors by allowing us to take up a lot of their warehouse space and use their space and to fulfill for us. So I'm slow to take advantage of it, but in any case, you'll have matching bottle numbers if you order the bundle. So I will be online at 8 o'clock Eastern or 8 o'clock Irish time, 3 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. And if anyone has any issues with our launch, I'll be online. We'll keep an eye on everything. We'll make sure it goes smoothly. And we only have 150 bundles. So when the bundles are gone, they're gone. So if you want a bundle, you can get a bundle as long as it's there. And there's no limit to the bundles. You can get 3 bundles or 4 bundles if you want to. First come, first served. But once the bundles are gone, it's just the individual bottles. And to preempt a question on the bundling of the individual bottles, there's no bundling in the sense of we don't have more swag or miniature bottles or glassware available if you wanted to buy 2 of the same bottle and bundle that. That's just not an option for us, unfortunately. So hopefully you all understand how it works and that it's smooth tomorrow evening. We've been very lucky so far, thanks to our fulfillment partner, and also just there's a hell of a lot of planning goes into it. So hopefully it all pays off tomorrow. All right, sherry time.
Sherry time. Before you move on really quickly, Barry, I just see a comment there from Caroline. No, Caroline, it's not the same spirit that we bottled with Dahi at WD O'Connell and Whiskey Bus 2. That was completely exclusive to us. This is 2 completely different releases. Yeah.
That was a single malt. We're releasing single pot stills. Very different spirit. 3 p.m. tomorrow, 3 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Eastern. There's 258 bottles of each, Mark. 258 bottles. All right. On we go.
Vamos, Jerez.
Jerez. Vamos a Jerez.
Vamos a Jerez.
All right. So, sherry. Lauren, do you have a memory of sherry as a child?
A memory of sherry as a child? To be brutally honest, I actually don't, because no one in my family, not even my grandparents, drank sherry. So I don't. But I know it is kind of traditionally being, oh, your granny loves a wee sherry, and we old ladies in the pub love a sherry or a hot sherry coming up to Christmas. I don't actually. I'm assuming you do.
I do. Yeah, I absolutely have a memory of sherry. I have a memory of my grandmother in our living room on a Sunday afternoon before Sunday lunch, sitting in the living room next to a tall cabinet that would have held the good glasses, and there would have been little Waterford crystal sherry glasses. And I always remember she would sit on the couch and we'd open up the cabinet, and it would always smell of old wood, and just it smelt very kind of rich smell from that wood, rich wood smell, but also had some whiskies and sherry in there, like a bottle of Powers and a bottle of Harvey's Bristol Cream, that blue bottle. So cream sherry, which is a very affordable sherry, kind of a cream sherry is just a blended sherry of a couple of styles of sherry together. And we would take down the Bristol Cream, we pour her a glass. She'd always have a glass of sherry, which is of Bristol Cream, which is kind of a medium sherry, somewhere between dry and sweet, before dinner, and she'd have the same after dinner. And so I remember that bottle. I remember the little bulbous black cork in it. And that's my earliest memory of sherry. And I think that for many people in Ireland and the UK of my age, so growing up in the 80s, that was the kind of the declining era of sherry as children and our parents started to move away from it, kind of rebel against it, as that being something of a different era. It did start to disappear. So that would be most people's abiding memory of sherry consumption back in the 80s and 90s, I think.
Yeah, definitely. We're getting serenaded in the comments here as well. Cian also said sherry trifle. That's a
that's true. Yeah, sherry trifle. I forgot about that. Yeah, the height of cuisine in Ireland in the 80s and 90s. A bit of custard, some fruit, drop of sherry, bit of jelly.
There's definitely been sherry trifle on the table at various family gatherings, but just not a direct
So,
sort of drinking of sherry.
but sherry's going through a revival. It is, you won't be able to move in a cocktail bar of any note in any part of the world now without seeing sherry cocktails. And bartenders, I think, are waking up to the, I suppose, the just what can be done, the flexibility of sherry and the flavor notes that it contributes, which can be quite, I mean, a range of flavor notes you just don't get in any other drinks, that can range from walnuts to plums to saltiness to just a kind of a dry woody note that are just quite unique to sherry. And we'll talk about how those notes are arrived at. But anyway, that's kind of the abiding memory. Let's talk a little bit about what sherry is then to begin with, because we hear this term. We might not, we know the whiskies that we enjoy sometimes are part sherry, cask matured. But what is sherry? So very simply, sherry is a wine. It's a wine that comes from a particular region in Spain, and it is a fortified wine, which means it has had alcohol added to it to increase its alcoholic content. So typically sherries are between 15 and 20% alcohol by volume, typically. And there are a number of different styles of it, but it is a fortified wine made from fermented grape juice. And it has a rich history. It has a history dating back millennia, if I'm not mistaken. And it is a wine that comes from the southwest of Spain, an area called Jerez, the Sherry Triangle, which we'll talk about in a little second. But there's a rich history, isn't there, Lauren, in the south of Spain? A lot of conflict and a lot of men waving swords at each other over the years.
Massively. And I think it's I read a really nice description that sherry is really a melting pot of many cultures and civilizations that have had an influence on not just this particular region in Spain, but the whole country essentially as well. The very first mention of sherry, it's, as Barry said, it's one of the oldest wines in the world. The very first mention is from a Greek geographer. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of his name, but it was Strabo, in 1st century BC. I think it was 1100 BC, and that the first wines were brought to the Jerez region by the Phoenicians around that time. And there's been influence from the Romans, from the Moors. It's unbelievable. We would genuinely be here. You could do a whole Shebeen, I think, on the history of sherry, but there's so many really interesting dates about kind of how it's developed over many centuries due to kind of consumer preference, the style of, sort of consumer preference is what they wanted more of. And then in 1932 as well, it got that DOP, which is kind of a destination of origin, or a denominación de origen protegida. So it's become a real, it's what sherry is to Spain, Irish whiskey is to Ireland, essentially. It really is.
And it's had a lot of, there are great connections between sherry and Northern Europe, Western Europe, Ireland, United Kingdom over the years. Going back about 700 years at least, we know that Spanish wines have been headed towards the UK, to Ireland. And there were many reasons for that. The British in their travels and their expeditions to take over the world from their small little island discovered the great wines of Spain, put in place great trading arrangements with the area to give them preference as merchants to ship these wines. Often great trading arrangements that were that really hurt the growers of the grapes, but really benefited these merchants, these British merchants who shipped these wines all over the world, even off to the United States. The wine started being fortified really around, I think, the 1600s and 1700s, mostly because you're talking about a time when we didn't have the same health controls and safety and food safety standards that we do today. And also, these wines were being shipped for many months across all kinds of climates and weather conditions, and were arriving to destinations spoiled. And the north of Spain kind of Catalan region developed a fortification method going back to maybe the 1400s or 1500s, but that started being applied to the wines as they started leaving Spain. So before they boarded the ship, they'd put a bit of alcohol into the barrel last minute, not the way they make it today, but they'd put a bit of high strength alcohol to kind of fortify, just like if we're fortified by having a good glass of whiskey, the wines were fortified to withstand long journeys, and that preserved them and meant they didn't arrive spoiled to their destinations. The Irish were the greatest consumers per capita of sherry at one point in time in the 1800s in the world. We'd love any kind of a drink we could get hold of. Fionnán O'Connor talks a lot about Spanish wines coming up, being mentioned a lot. When he was on with us a few weeks ago, he talked about Spanish wines, and I think he talked about the Queen of Spain's drink. And they've got a long, rich history with Ireland and with the United Kingdom. It's only in the last 200 years we've started seeing laws being put in place to protect, preserve, define what sherry is and can be. And the last 100 years, like Lauren mentioned, in the 1930s, putting in place that DOG, and then getting GI confirmation or GI classification, like Irish whiskey is GI or geographical indicator status in the European Union. Sherry got that in 1986, really Sherry / Jerez got that in 1986 to protect what it is and where it can be made. Geographically, the geography is everything for sherry. Without it, there is no thing as sherry, because sherry, by its very name, is Jerez. Jerez is a region in the southwest of Spain on the Iberian Peninsula, just really south east of Portugal, and only at its closest tip about 14 kilometers north of Africa. So a very hot, dry, for the most part of the world. The Sherry Triangle is defined by 3 towns: Jerez de la Frontera, Sanlúcar de Barrameda, and El Puerto de Santa Maria. And those 3 towns are really connected informally in that triangle. So all of the grapes must be grown within that region, and all of the maturation must take place inside warehouses in those 3 towns, in Sanlúcar de Barrameda, in Jerez de la Frontera, and in El Puerto de Santa Maria. Grapes can be brought in from outside Jerez if there's a particularly bad season. If the harvest is bad, for example, those grapes can be brought in from Montilla, and that can help with ensuring that there's a supply as well. So geographically, Jerez is what sherry is. There's the etymology of that name. There's a number of explanations as to why we call it sherry. The one I like the most is that the British arrived there and asked where they were, and they were told Jerez, and they said, great, sherry, that'll do. And that was it. And it just became the Anglicization, just like they did with all of the Irish towns when they decided, when they started mapping out the towns in the 1800s, and they committed Anglicization to maps. I think the same thing happened here in Jerez. So Jerez does mean sherry.
They actually, as well, in Jerez and with sherry production, they speak a lot about terroir as well, and the influence of that particular region on obviously the production, the growth of grapes, and the production of the sherry in general. So Jerez is the southernmost winemaking region in continental Europe. They get, I think it's 300 days of sunshine a year, which is insane. So you think it's perfect weather for growing grapes. And I think it's 620 liters, I think, is all they really get kind of in the winter months. But in Ireland, you would get that in a week, probably maybe a few days sometimes as well. Like, obviously you physically cannot grow grapes in Ireland. So it's really interesting. And they kind of cultivate their vineyards in a way that collects the water, the rainfall that they do get, and the water's kind of fed back into the vines as and when the vines need it. So they've really kind of cultivated, used the land, worked with the rainfall, the annual rainfall, excuse me, to really benefit the growth of these grapes as well, which is unbelievable. And the soil as well, it's really chalky, it's white soil, it retains that humidity. And the humidity and the proximity to the coast is also something really important, which we'll talk about later for the development of flora. So bear that in mind, because we will come on to that. But again, the region is, the terroir is massively important. So for the terroir doubters, they don't just talk about it in whiskey, they talk about it in wine.
So if you ever see the word sherry in a bottle, you can be guaranteed that it has come from the sherry triangle, the triangle loosely, not loosely, but fairly rigidly around those three towns. And just like Irish whiskey, if it says Irish whiskey in the bottle, it was made in Ireland. As long as you bought it in a country that recognizes the GI. There are just 3 grapes used in the production of sherry, and I think it's going to surprise you a little bit about these grapes. So Palomino is the most common grape that's used in 90% of all sherry that's produced. Muscatel and Pedro Jimenez are the 2 other grapes, and Muscatel and Pedro Jimenez are used in very, very small quantities. But Palomino is the one that you'll see most often. And surprisingly, despite sherry's color, sherry is made from green grapes. Is made from green/white grapes. That is a Pedro Jimenez grape you're seeing there, which can surprise people considering how syrupy dark a Pedro Jimenez is. Now, Pedro Jimenez is the sweetest of all of the sherries. In fact, it's the sweetest wine on earth, and there's a reason for that. These grapes, before they are brought into the production process, are going to be laid out to sun dry, a bit like a sun-dried tomato. And as they do, the water is going to evaporate, the flavors are going to concentrate, and you're going to be left with a very, very, very sweet, grape flesh that once it's pressed is going to give a very, very rich flavor profile. The color of sherry is going to come from the oxidation process and partly to the barrel that it's aged in, but mostly due to oxidation later on in the production process.
Yeah, this was something you mentioned, the color of the grape. That was something when I started obviously getting into whiskey and my journey in the whiskey industry, learning about wines and the influence of the wine casks on the whiskey. This was the one thing that really threw me, because you assumed when you looked at a sherry, like an Oloroso sherry, you're like, that has to be a red grape. It has to. So yeah, it's just so interesting how it's actually the process, as again we'll talk about, that influences the color.
Which is different than normal wines, where depending on how long the skins are left in, is going to determine whether the wine is red or white. So yeah, the grapes are really interesting. So Pedro Jimenez is probably the most familiar, I think, to most sherry drink or most whiskey drinkers. They're Muscatel and Palomino. I mean, you don't hear of Palomino because there is no Palomino sherry. Palomino grape is used to make other sherries, but Muscatel goes on to become a Muscatel sherry. Pedro Jimenez goes on to become a Pedro Jimenez sherry. Palomino, poor Palomino, doesn't go on to become a Palomino sherry, but it ends up being the most important of all the grapes, interestingly. Is it dried like a raisin? Yeah, it is kind of that process, not as long. Exactly. The production process then is not dissimilar to the early stages of whiskey production. You take the grape, you crush that grape, you get the must, the juice of that grape that is then put into large fermenters where water and yeast is added. Depending on the yeast, it can be a live strain, it can be a cultivated strain for that particular bodega. But what's happening here, of course, is that the sugars that exist inside that grape must, inside that juice, are being converted into alcohol, carbon dioxide, and heat. No different than the fermentation process with whiskey. Now, the grape juice through this fermentation is brought up to about, I think it's about 10%. 10 or 12, maybe a little bit higher percent, depending on 11 or 12% alcohol. And this fermentation process is the first step in the post. I suppose once the grapes are taken off the vines, this is the first step of the winemaking process.
And something that's quite interesting as well, just to go back slightly, the first kind of pressing to get that must, to get that grape juice, is what they consider the finest juice. So I guess just that you don't have to kind of forcibly remove from the grape, it kind of flows naturally. And that actually tends to go on to be more of the cleaner, kind of dry, crisp sherries, because they consider it to be the finest juice. And then the second extraction of juice would go on to be kind of the more sort of richer, sort of slightly deeper sherries, which again we'll come on to, like Oloroso. And then the third, if they extract any more extractions, kind of goes on to be distilled in different ways, lesser wines or vinegar as well.
Once the wine has been fermented and reached the alcohol strength through the fermentation process, next comes these fantastic architectural structures, above ground cellars is how you could best describe them. These are like castle-like structures. These are the sherry bodegas, and they were developed in the 17 and 1800s as the laws evolved in the Jerez region to age sherries in large warehouses. Sometimes could be close to the coast, but mostly inside the sherry triangle there. Interestingly, there were kind of 3-tier system within the sherry producers that gave rise to these large structures. The first was the grape grower themselves. They were, of course, the very important. They're like the farmers in the whiskey process. The grape growers were the first. The third layer were those that shipped the wine overseas. But that meant you needed somebody in the middle. You needed somebody to get the wine, to get the grapes from the grape grower, eventually to be shipped. And that gave rise to the equivalent of a whiskey bonder, but in the Spanish world. And these wine bonders, as such, developed these large bodegas that they used to mature the sherry, age the sherry, and eventually later on in the 20th century could be bottlers as well, bottling up the sherry. So you'll see these all over the Jerez region. I think this one is Bodegas Lustau. In famously, you'll know the name Lustau from Redbreast Lustau, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But inside in these large above ground warehouses, what they're doing is they are aging their sherry and they are doing fractional maturation. What you're seeing on the screen here is a pyramidal shape, which you will see hundreds of them. If I go back to the screen, you'll see them all there. They can be from 3 high up to 12 high, depending on the bodega. And this is called the Solera y Criadera system. Solera just kind of means floor and or ground. And what you've got is you've got a series of layers of differently aged sherries. Now, this was a system developed in the late 1700s, right, Lauren?
That's right, yeah. So it was around the 1770s, and it was really keeping the British sherry consumer in mind, as they wanted more kind of consistency with their sherry. So say, for example, if a bodega a sherry sort of brand had issues, maybe a harvest wasn't fantastic a certain year, they wouldn't want to take sherry from that one harvest that had been placed into, say, maybe 4 or 5 barrels as an example, and all bottle that at once. So the same way that we might blend a whiskey for consistency and complexity, it originated around that time to do that. So when you're drinking sherry, you could be drinking from a really old harvest that you don't even realize, which is quite interesting, as the way they move the sherry down as it ages. And I think it's a third of each barrel is all that's allowed by law to go on to be bottled. It can't be any more than a third from each sort of level. Yeah.
Tony has a question there about the first press. Is it called a certain name? Yeah, it's Mosto Yema.
Yeah. Or Primera Yema. Yeah.
And this system of fractional maturation is really interesting and something that a couple of distilleries are trialing at the moment. I know it's a very complex system from a tax accounting standpoint, but what you're seeing on the screen is the Solera is the bottom layer, and that is mother sherry. That's what you're going to bottle. That is when you go to bottle your sherries, you take it from the mother layer. You take it from mother sherry, which is the bottom layer. It contains the oldest sherries. One layer above that is slightly younger, and a layer above that slightly younger, and a layer above that the youngest still. And every time you take from mother sherry, you take from the Solera layer, you go to the first Criadera, the second Criadera, third Criadera, and you are replacing the Criadera below it with whatever you've taken out of it. Now, you may only take out 1/10 of the Solera at the bottom, which means that your Solera may have 100 plus years of sherries that are fractionally maturing in there. So there's a great consistency. So when you talk about a sherry that's bottled in 1995, like a 1995 vintage, what you're really saying is that in 1995, I extracted from mother Solera, and that is my 1995 vintage, even though it may contain 100 plus years of sherries, which is fantastic.
It's amazing, and I think it's something that it's almost impossible to explain without a diagram, because I think it can get quite confusing, the moving around of the certain barrels. But it's so interesting, like the vintage harvests that can be in there. And when you think about it, certain sherries are actually relatively affordable for possibly
Oh, they
having
are
quite an old vintage in there. Like
so
it's
affordable.
unbelievable when you think about how old the vintage harvest in that Solera barrel could be versus what you pay for the sherry. It's unbelievably affordable. Yeah.
So something really interesting about the Solera system is that the Solera system is made out of American oak.
Yeah.
Now, we often think about Spain, we think about sherry, we think about Spanish oak, we think about European oak. But ever since they've been using the Solera system, they have tried to use as much as possible American oak. Now, you will find Spanish oak occasionally, you'll find French oak occasionally, but you will, for the most part, see the Solera system is built out of American oak. Since America was discovered in the 1400s by Christopher Columbus, apparently, who knows? St. Brendan really, he discovered it first. But the Spanish have been bringing wood back to Spain, and they have found that American oak is far better for long-term aging. Now, they want the older wood, the better. The older the barrels, the older the wood, the better. Before they're ever used in the Solera system, the American barrels the American butts are seasoned with sherry themselves, and they don't want any wood contribution in the sherry. So in the world of whiskey, we're dying for the wood contribution. We're yearning for it. In the world of sherry, that's the last thing they want. They just want a vessel to allow the oxygenation of their sherry inside it, in a vessel that is not completely airtight, because no wooden barrel or wooden cask is. So these are sherry butts. They are 500 liters in size. They're made predominantly with American oak. And I think that's an interesting fact. The history of Spanish oak being used in sherry is more in transportation barrels. So up until the 1980s, if you wanted sherry in Ireland, it was shipped into Ireland in transportation butts. Those would have been made of what at the time was considered cheaper, inferior casks, and those would have been European oak. They would not have been as good for long-term aging, so Spanish oak would have been used. So in Ireland, UK, we found all these Spanish oak sherry butts arriving on our shores, and we started using them for whiskey maturation. In the 1980s, the Spanish government changed the laws around exporting sherry, and they passed a law that required all sherry leaving Spain to leave the country in a bottle, which meant that the transportation butts disappeared, and they were no longer part of the sherry process. So today, what happens is, if we want a sherry cask, what we're really saying is we want to recreate a time when transportation casks were used. And so we order casks to be seasoned to order, to be made to order, seasoned to order, and then shipped to Ireland, even though they were never used officially in the world of sherry making.
It's a massive business now. In fact, the majority of sherry casks that we use in the whiskey industry, they're created by the bodegas, and they age sherry in them specifically for the Irish and Scotch whiskey industries. You wouldn't really, as you said, Barry, you wouldn't really have a bodega aging sherry, their own sherry that they will eventually bottle and sell under their own name to a distillery. It doesn't really happen. So it's so interesting that that's kind of how that industry was created. It's very interesting. As you say, it kind of, the reason why all the barrels kind of stayed in Ireland and Scotland and the UK in the first place is because it didn't make financial sense to send them back to Spain. So
Empty,
we stored our alcohol in them, stored the whiskey in them.
And I've heard people like Kevin O'Gorman in Middleton and Billy Lighton in Middleton, who'd be very involved with the Spanish, especially with Bodegas Listau and Jerez, talk about how long it takes. It's 2 years of seasoning the sherry cask, and typically it's up to 2 years of drying, when you cut down a Spanish oak tree, drying out the staves, making the sherry butts, then 2 years of seasoning. So it's about 4 years from the time you want the cask until the time it starts being shipped to you. But they talk about how the sherry that's seasoned inside, it's a good deal for everybody, because Irish distilleries get the seasoned cask, the seasoned butt, and the sherry bodegas get to keep the sherry. Some of them will use that sherry. Now, it's not all turned into vinegar. Like, some of it is but some of it's actually put back into the Solera system. Once it has to have reached, like with Oloroso, minimum aging for at least a year, which is what seasoning is 2 years. So there are strict rules about what you can and can't do with sherry, so that you're not interfering with the Solera system of aging. But it's very, very it's fascinating how they age their sherries this way. David's got a point there about, he said, I've spoken with Dr. Rachel Barry from Glendronach about this. They are exclusively sherry matured. That's a great, that's a good question, David, about whether they are or not, because our research tells us that there's only one distillery in Ireland or England or Ireland or the UK that is exclusively sherry casks. That's Tamdhu. No Irish distillery uses exclusive sherry casks. And my understanding is that Glendronach uses bourbon barrels as well, and that sherry casks are part of it. But if I'm wrong, I'm open to it. But all of our research from talking to a number of people pointed to Tamdhu being the last remaining 100% sherry cask distillery in Ireland or Scotland. Interesting. So worth diving into. Right. This is where it gets both complex, interesting, tricky, fascinating, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So sherry can age in 3 different ways. So the image that you see on the screen there is biological aging, or aging under flor. So I said earlier to keep flor in mind because it's massively important in the aging of sherry. So flor is really a type of naturally occurring yeast. So we mentioned the terroir, the climate, the proximity to the coast. It's very humid in this particular region of Spain. So flor is a naturally occurring yeast that forms what you can see on top of the sherry there. It's a white layer, which stops it from having contact with oxygen. So we'll come on to this when we talk about the actual styles of sherry, but this would be sort of a fino, a manzanilla style of sherry. So it's very, very interesting. So no contact with oxygen. The second is exposure to oxygen, oxidative aging. And the third is a hybrid, so a hybrid of both.
So let's pause there for 1 second, because I just want to get clear on these points.
Yeah.
We talked earlier about when you have fermented your sherry, you fermented your wine.
Yep.
You then have a choice as to what you do with it. So we already said that some of it is already predestined for the dry sherries because it was the first pressing, right? So if you just take that section and say, right, the first pressing, we're now going to separate that further. And the high quality, fine, yet lower in alcohol sherry, so like 12 to 14% ABV, they're going to be 2/3 filled into the Solera system, which allows the flor to naturally develop because the alcohol is still low enough for yeast to develop. But interestingly, the yeast doesn't do a secondary fermentation. It just provides a barrier. It doesn't look for more sugars. It just sits there as insulation. And then the other second pressing, no, still the first pressing, the other part of that goes into the 2/3 full into a barrel, but a higher alcohol strength is added, like a fortification happens at that stage. Now, fortification may have happened to get it up to 12 to 14 in the first case, but even more alcohol is added to get it up to 15 to 17% to go into the barrels, so that no flor can develop on top because the alcohol level is too high for yeast to survive, right?
Yeah, so it's 17% that the flor can't survive. So that would be like an Oloroso, for example. The flor can't survive at that level of alcohol. It can only survive, as Barry said, between 12 and 15%. And this is all predetermined. So the free roam juice that we talked about earlier will be fortified to 15% to allow the formation of flor. And then the second pressing, if you like, is typically like the Oloroso styles of sherry, which is fortified to 17% for the oxidative aging. So there's so many. It'll make more sense, I think, when we get into the actual styles of sherry. We can go through them individually, but it's so interesting. It's so interesting.
So that means you could have this is the non-oxidative. This is the biological aging, right?
Yeah.
Where the color is changing a little bit, but not as much as when you have no floor, because when you have no floor, the oxygen that's naturally in the barrel and the wood itself will contribute to a color, which is why Oloroso sherry, which is oxidative aging, is darker than a Fino or a Manzanilla that are biologically aged, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if you think about it, yeast eats sugar. So the styles of sherry that have been biologically aged are typically more dry, more fresh, more clean on the palate, if you like. Whereas those that have had exposure to oxygen tend to be a little bit heavier, a little bit more rich. And again, when we cover the actual styles of sherry, it'll make a lot more sense. But yeah, that's a great image. I think it makes sense. The kind of, so you're moving here from Fino up to PX.
Yeah.
So this is dry into sweet, more so.
So the first three are on the left are dry. So Fino, Manzanilla, they're dry. Amontillado, Palo Cortado is dry, and Oloroso is dry. Now, we talked about Fino and Manzanilla being that kind of first pressing. Amontillado, which is what our Stories and Sips cask, one of our casks is, Amontillado cask, quite unusual in the world of Irish whiskey. Very few of them. One of how Amontillado becomes a sherry is that it starts off as a Fino or a Manzanilla, and as the floor disappears, or more high-strength alcohol is added to kill it off, oxidative aging happens on top of the biological aging, which gives you an Amontillado. So an Amontillado is a hybrid. It's a hybrid of biological aging and oxidative aging. Palo Cortado is the wine owner, the bodega owner will sample his Amontillados and he'll say, hold on a second, there's one Amontillado here that is better than all the others. This has great potential. We're going to put this aside. We're going to add maybe a little bit more alcohol to it. This is our Palo Cortado. And that's how Palo Cortado is developed. So Amontillado is Palo Cortado.
Yeah, so Palo Cortado literally translates as cut stick, and they call it the magic sherry because with Amontillado, as Barry said, it starts out as being like a Fino or a Manzanilla, but then it's fortified to stop the floor from growing further and developing. Whereas for some reason with Palo Cortado sherries, the floor disappears naturally, which is why they think it's magic and it's called magic sherry. So it's really unusual. I think it's like only 5% of sherry production is Palo Cortado. It's very, very unusual that this happens, and nobody knows why. It's probably just down to the environment, could be the location in the warehouse, a variety of things. Same with whiskey and how whiskey behaves. It's down to a lot of kind of external environmental factors. So when you're drinking a Palo Cortado aged whiskey, it's actually very rare. So I think Dumvilles would be probably the most popular, certainly within the group. As an example, their 10-year and their 21-year. So yes, it's basically magic sherry. That's what it's called in Jerez.
And as you can see, like moving from left to right, as the colors are getting darker, it's not due to time in the wood. It's due to the more oxygen that is being let in to allow the grape juice, the fermented grape juice, the wine to oxidize further. So Amontillado is a little bit darker, but it's still quite pale compared to Oloroso, which would be darker, Muscatel darker still, and then Pedro Jimenez darker still. So Fino, Manzanilla, Amontillado, Palo Cortado, and Oloroso are all what would be called dry sherries. Muscatel and Pedro Jimenez are the sweet cherries. You don't hear much about Muscatel. There's not very much of it made. No. There's not a lot of grapes grown. And Pedro Jimenez would be the same, but Pedro Jimenez would be more familiar to us because it is so sweet. Now, Pedro Jimenez sherries, you either love them or you hate them. And same with Pedro Jimenez aged whiskies. Pedro Jimenez is so syrupy and thick as a sherry, you could pour it over vanilla ice cream, chop a few walnuts, and have a lovely dessert for yourself.
And especially when it's aged for quite a considerable amount of time as well, you almost get like kind of molasses, like really thick, syrupy, kind of sugary notes, even imparted through to the whiskey eventually as well. So as you said earlier, Barry, it's one of the sweetest sherries in the world. And Oloroso is exclusively oxidized maturation as well. It's very commonly used, like Middleton would use a lot of Oloroso, Bushmills used a lot of Oloroso sherry casks. They'd be very, very, very commonly used. So, and I think as well, just a very small point, people hear the word dry a lot. It's used for sherry, it's used for vermouth as well. You'll say dry and sweet vermouth. When we talk about dry, a dry style of sherry, it doesn't mean dry versus wet. It means dry as in the absence of sugar. So it hasn't been sweetened. There's no natural presence of sugar in there. And therefore, it's a little bit more crisp, a little bit more clean, dry on your palate. So you'll hear it with vermouth an awful lot as well.
And when I was doing the tasting notes for our Amontillado cask from W.D. O'Connell, it was amazing to try and detect that 2 years of maturation in a sherry butt and try and understand. And before I had gone down the rabbit hole of trying to understand Amontillado more, I'd already done my tasting notes and had come up with notes that do mirror what we've now learned about Amontillado, which is that there's a mixture of crispness, it's lighter, but there's also the dark fruit notes, but not as sweet as we're used to with perhaps certainly not Pedro Jimenez, but even Oloroso. So it's dry, nutty, sometimes even kind of doughy like, and sometimes can be even a little bit salty as well. So that's quite interesting. Oloroso, of course, is the one we see most of, like Lauren said, in the world of Irish whiskey currently.
Massively. Yeah, I did the same with my WD O'Connell. Went back to it, obviously it being Fino aged, and it is so interesting now taking what I've learned and actually thinking about it more when I'm drinking the whiskey. And it's something that's so interesting to do. One of my very last tastings actually with Bushmills was using the wine, so that a particular whiskey, taking the particular sherry cask or wine that it had been aged in and tasting it alongside the whiskey. It's so interesting to do that because I feel you gain much more of an appreciation of where your flavor is coming from, and you can really see it being pulled through from the sherry, the particular style of sherry influence, into the whiskey. So it's great to do that as well. This is brilliant. I think we couldn't have written this out better ourselves, to be fair.
So some of the flavor influences there from sherry casks, from the different styles. But even as the headline, like if you look at Fino Manzanilla, crisp and dry, Amontillado, nutty and dry, Oloroso is complex and rich, and Pedro Jimenez is sweet, rich and thick. And I think this is helpful as we think about choosing an Irish whiskey based on its sherry cask profile or based on its sherry cask maturation or aging. Do we like something that's sweeter? Do we like something that's drier? And there's no wrong or right answer. And there's probably a whiskey / sherry combination, depending on whatever it is your preference. So it's something to bear in mind. If you like a sweeter whiskey, you might prefer from Oloroso to PX. If you like a drier, nuttier, perhaps more layered, crispier whiskey, you might prefer going towards Amontillado, Palo Cortado, and to a lesser extent, Fino Manzanilla, which we don't see much of at all in the world of Irish whiskey.
It's so interesting now going between a Fino and a PX finish, even on the nose straight away. It's like chalk and cheese. It really is.
I need to. So I've had Amontillado there, and I'm going to pour out an Oloroso from Redbreast. And we're going to talk about Irish whiskey. So look, here's just by comparison of color. We're going to put up on full screen again.
Wow, look at that.
So Amontillado here, Oloroso here. Now, just 2 years in Amontillado here, and let's be honest, 15 years in Oloroso, but still that the length of time wouldn't have changed massively the color here at all. It would just be more the wood and the style of sherry that was in there before. Quickly there, just some questions. Question from Caroline: Port is a sweet fortified wine. How is it different from sherry? Almost the same approach. Port is from Portugal, the Douro Valley or Porto region of Portugal, to the northwest of the Jerez region, so in Portugal as opposed to Spain, and they have a slightly different approach to how they grow their vine, their grapes as well. Different grape varietals are used for making port, and and a different process for aging, admittedly, as well, because they have open air maturation as well, kind of out in the sun as well as inside. We'll do one on port as well. We'll do an episode on port one of the days, one of the
Good
weeks.
shout. Graham's also asked a question. As I understand it, PX sherry isn't made with Palomino grapes. You're right, Graham. It's made with Pedro Jimenez grapes. So it's a silent whiskey, but it's also a grape as well.
And interestingly, Pedro Jimenez grapes, like I mentioned earlier, they must typically be grown within the sherry region, the Jerez region, but they can be brought in from outside of that if there's been a poor harvest, or if there's a shortage of grapes. They can be brought in from Montilla, for example. In fact, I think that most of the Pedro Jimenez actually grows in Montilla as opposed to Jerez, to the best of my knowledge.
You're right. Yes, Montilla Moriles is where most of the PX grapes grow. Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah.
Which is a quick sidebar here on our Cliffs of Moher whiskey. So there's two issues with this label. We've only ever spoken about one, which is that we couldn't call it an Irish whiskey because it left a government-approved bonded warehouse and aged for another 3 months in the Cliffs of Moher, up on the O'Brien's Tower, before being bottled. So it kind of lost its status as Irish whiskey. It's still the same drink. But the second thing that I didn't really go into at the time, and it didn't really matter at the time, but it's an appropriate time to talk about it now. If you have a bottle of Cliffs of Moher, look at the back of the label, and you'll see where it says Oloroso or Palo Cortado. You'll notice it doesn't say the word sherry. And the reason it doesn't say the word sherry is because these were wines that came from Montilla. So when Louise McGuan went to Spain to source her casks, her quarter casks that were used in the maturation of these whiskies on the Cliffs of Moher, she went to a company called Casnolia. Casnolia is not in Jerez, they're in Montilla themselves. And she wanted these very fine handmade casks to be filled with wines that she loved. And so she drove around Montilla, going to from retasting and sampling and deciding what she wanted to season the casks with. All of the wines that she chose were from the Montilla region. They're not from Jerez. Now, because they're not aged in Sanlúcar de Barrameda or in Jerez de la Frontera or in Puerto de Santa Maria, they can't be called sherry, even if you brought the grapes in.
Yeah.
Like they're not aged there, and so they couldn't be called sherry. So interestingly, Cliffs of Moher, while it says pot still whiskey finished in an Oloroso cask, it's not pot still Irish whiskey, and it's not an Oloroso sherry cask. You've been had. Who sold you these things?
So what you're saying is you broke every rule in the rule book to bring out those whiskies.
I know, it's amazing, but it also does go to show the ridiculousness of labels sometimes, and what it can belie, what it can hide, what it can prevent us, the consumer, from knowing, And also I think that, for example, a whiskey is not going to be any less of a quality if it comes out of one warehouse that had an approval stamp on it and go into a house beside it for 6 months. It doesn't make the whiskey any less. No. It's still a great whiskey, but it's just not past the very strict checkbox kind of requirements. So anyway, I think that's quite interesting. Let's talk maybe about sherry and Irish whiskey then, more in depth.
Absolutely. I'm going to, just while we're switching up the conversation, I'm going to switch whiskey. So I'm going to move on to the Sexton. So an Oloroso.
Oh, I've got this friend at hand, 18 years in an Oloroso sherry cask. It's an absolutely staggeringly good whiskey. I'm down to my last, 6 drops. It won't be gone tonight. 6 nights.
Drinking straight from the bottle.
So how did Irish whiskey get intertwined with the world of sherry, you might ask? Well, let Lauren there have a few sips and put a few hairs in her chest. Sherry casks moving to Ireland, transporting the wine to Ireland for the last 400 years, gave us access to vessels to mature our whiskey. I can tell you this, that there was no concern paid to what was in those barrels prior to whiskey being put into them in the 1700s, the 1800s, and for a lot of the 1900s, in fact. We didn't know the impact that wood had. We didn't know what the previous contents could do to a whiskey. We just knew if the end result was good, bad, or killed us. And the reality is that it wasn't until the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and probably even all the way up to the 1980s that we really got an understanding of what the different grains were, the grain structure of wood was, and how it contributed to Irish whiskey. So the transportation barrels that were used to send the sherry that had aged in American Solera, American wood Solera built systems, those transportation barrels were made of European oak, Spanish oak typically, much looser grain, more open grain, more porous, allows for the movement of spirit and wines in and out of that barrel, allows for great maturation. Also, different compounds in the wood allow for kind of darker colors, more rich kind of wood sugars and spices to come out of those woods. So we've learned that sherry is good, and sherry is the backbone of many of the whiskies that you know and love in Ireland today. In fact, we wouldn't have Redbreast doesn't exist without sherry casks. In fact, it is the very profile of Redbreast is the sherry cask. The spot whiskies is exactly the same. The original spot whiskies, they had no bourbon barrels using them at all. Bourbon barrels didn't find their way to Ireland until the late 1950s, early 1960s at the earliest. And up until that point, if we were using sherry casks, what they would have done in the likes of Mitchell and Son, when they were maturing the spot whiskies underground, under the cellars in Dublin, they would have had different types of sherry casks that they would have vatted together to make their green spot, their red spot, their blue spot at the time. It would have been all sherry cask maturation for them. We also in Ireland in the 1800s and the 1900s had the likes of rum casks. We would have had wine casks from France predominantly, some from Spain, maybe to a lesser degree from Italy as well. But sherry casks played a huge role because we consumed a lot of sherry in Ireland, and so we had a lot of barrels available to us. Do we want to learn a little bit about casks?
Absolutely. Just before you move on, I think this is something, and it kind of, when I was in Galway, just at the end of last week, it was kind of re-emphasized to me, the importance in the Latin connection with Ireland. So you think about it, Barry, you mentioned about the sherry cask coming in kind of filled with sherry, and they would have come mainly in obviously via the port. So think Dublin, Belfast, Cork, Galway as well. And if you think about a brand like Mickle, they really put that kind of emphasis on that Latin tie with their home with Galway, because so many of the sort of sherry casks, port casks, Madeira casks would have been coming in to Galway. Yep. And they would have been used massively in the whiskey industry, obviously. So their kind of core releases are all based on port, sherry, and Madeira for that exact reason. They're kind of really emphasizing that sort of Latin tie, which I think is great. And you made a fantastic point as well. So many people don't realize bourbon casks weren't really used in Ireland until the 1960s because they're so prevalent today. And most distilleries, most brands, in fact, I would say nearly every brand has a bourbon cask release or a bourbon influence of some description in there as well. So yeah, we've a long tie, we've long Latin history.
And a lot of those whiskies historically that use these casks would have been in port cities, Cork, exactly. Dublin, Galway, Belfast, Limerick, where trading happened. Spices and wines and rums came in, and then those ships went back out with leather, with butter, with grain, with whiskey out into the world. So a nice trade was happening in the 1800s and 1900s there as well. Sherry casks then.
Sherry casks, yeah. So the most commonly used, I would say, in the Irish whiskey industry, and you'll hear, if you go to a whiskey tasting, you'll hear the brand representative or whoever it may be talking about hogsheads and butts. So they would be the most two commonly used sizes. So obviously when you think about it, the smaller the cask, the quicker the maturation, there's less surface area for the spirit inside to cover. So therefore you will get kind of more of an influence really in a shorter space of time. So sherry hogsheads, which are 250 litres, and sherry butts would be the two most commonly used types of casks. So the butts are 500 litres. Huge. I mean, I was about to say I could fit inside one of them, but that's probably not an accurate descriptor because I'm only 5'1", but they're absolutely massive. When you see them in the warehouses in the back, lined up, especially in comparison to a bourbon cask, which is 200 litres, they're so impactful. It's the one kind of size of barrel that really makes you turn your head and you think, wow, that's unbelievable. Then I say the third and fourth. So bourbon, obviously 200 liters, arguably the most common. I would say Butt's the second, and then you have the port and the Madeira. So port pipes are 550, as you can see there, and Madeira drums 650. And they would be also obviously massively used for whiskey maturation as well.
And butt is a unit of measurement. It has been aligned on. So like it's a legal thing. So if you ever ask somebody for a buttload of something, if they don't bring you 500 liters of it, they've sold you short.
They're robbing you blind. Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about the different styles of sherry then, and how they have made an appearance in Irish whiskey. And this was quite an interesting dive. This doesn't cover every single Irish whiskey ever or out there today, but just gives you some examples. So starting with Amontillado, obviously we've got our own single pot still Amontillado that releases tomorrow, which is one of them. W.D. O'Connell also has a 5-year-old single malt that was aged in an Amontillado cask. There is a very rare peated one, which is the Connemara Amontillado. That was released, I think, in 1999. It doesn't turn up very often. You might see it at an auction occasionally, but that's an early use in the modern whiskey industry of Amontillado. J.J. Corrie uses Amontillado casks both from sherry, from Jerez, and from Montilla. And the Boan also uses Amontillado casks in both some of their Whistler releases and in their private cask program as well.
I've heard of the Connemara, but I've genuinely never come across it on auction. Actually, as you say, it really doesn't appear very often.
Palo Cortado, the rarest of them all, really. Yep. Dunville's is where we'd see most of it. They have a range, quite a few Palo Cortados that have been typically quite award-winning as they've released them. And again, you have to think, when whiskies are winning awards left, right, and center, what are the inputs into that whiskey that got it to that stage? High quality spirit, aged in great bourbon barrels originally, then transferred into sherry casks for long, in some cases, maturations. Like Dunville's have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 year long recaskings, and you could call them really secondary maturations in these sherry casks. But a Palo Cortado cask is going to be that super high quality of dry, rich, dry, nutty sherry.
It's one of my favorite finishes, and as we said earlier, you can think of it as magic sherry now, for the reasons we explained. So less about 5%, probably but around about 5% of the sherry produced in Jerez in Spain is Palo Cortado. So very, very rare.
And Boan as well are using it in their private cask program and in some of their releases. Now, some of the distilleries will be experimenting with all of these styles of sherry cask. They might not all be out in the open or out on market yet, but if there's others that we're missing as well, feel free to suggest them. Oloroso, then, of course, the most common of them all. So every bottle of Redbreast, except for all port Redbreast, which are pretty rare, pretty rare. But almost every other Redbreast is part of the components were fully aged in Oloroso sherry casks. Jameson is a bourbon and sherry cask matured whiskey. We don't often think about that, but the pot still component of of Jameson is matured in sherry casks as well as bourbon barrels. Every one of the spot whiskies has had an Oloroso cask component, as well as bourbon, as well as, in some cases, something else. So green spot was just bourbon Oloroso. Yellow spot, you get into what? Is it Malaga? Red spot, Marsala, or whichever. I always get those mixed up.
There's Malaga, Madeira, all in there.
Blue spot, Madeira. Dunville's, of course, our own 19-year-old Dunville's was the winner when I did a sampling of the 6 different Dunville's that we had to choose from for our release there earlier in the year. Dunville's 19-year-old Oloroso, 6 years, more than 6 years, short of 7 years in an Oloroso sherry. But the Irishman uses Oloroso sherry casks. Aharu whiskey. Lauren, you're drinking the Sexton, which is the Sexton all sherry cask, all Oloroso sherry?
Yeah, so that was actually a point I was going to make earlier. Is it was an interesting journey for the Sexton in the sense that when Alex was kind of sampling casks in the early days of the Sexton, she initially wanted it to be first fill Oloroso, but it was too sweet. It was way too kind of sherry heavy, very, very, just very overpowering on the flavor profile. So it is all Oloroso, but it's first, second, and third fill. So casks, which Bushmills have used once, twice, and 3 times, obviously, as well, to kind of round it out and balance it off. But again, same with Redbreast, same with Middleton. Every Bushmills core release is an Oloroso age in there somewhere.
Black Bush, Napo Castle, and the list goes on. I mean, almost every time you see the word sherry cask maturation, it's Oloroso. Question from Graham, who I had the pleasure of running into in a bar in Glasgow last week. Hi to you, Graham. Question about sherry transportation casks arriving in England would have been imported by wine merchants like Harvey's of Bristol. Would there have been key similar wine or sherry merchants in Ireland? There were. Gilbey's, Irish and English themselves, who were the originators of Redbreast, were a big sherry importer. Mitchell's were a big sherry and wine importer. Then go down the country further to the likes of Cork, you got Woodford Burn, which were a big wine and sherry importer as well. So back in the day, you would have seen Middleton whiskies bottled up by Woodford Burn. And to this day, there's a bar, the bar in Cork off the Grand Parade called Woodford, or the Woodford Burn. That is the old home of Woodford Burn wine merchants. And you go in there, you get the worst Irish coffee in Cork in there, but you get a great selection of whiskies. Don't order the Irish coffee, but order a whiskey. And then a quick point there, folks, if you haven't hit the like button, give it an old punch there while you're watching. That always helps us as well. So Oloroso, it would be a shame if people overlooked Oloroso, thinking that we got to go for the rare or the Palo Cortados, we got to go find something, the Pedro Jimenez. Oloroso is an extraordinary sherry for maturation.
I always say if something is used a lot, there is a reason for it, and that's because it's fantastic. And that balance of kind of the sort of nuttiness, the sweetness is just fantastic with whiskey. It really is.
There's another Irish connection in the world of sherry. You talk about wine importers or sherry importers. The largest bodega in Jerez is called La Patricia, or Los Patricios. And it is named after St. Patrick, and it was founded by an Irishman called William Garvey, and he was a farmer from Waterford who wanted to buy a few sheep. He wanted to buy a few merino sheep for their wool, and he wanted to bring them back to Waterford. And the story goes, he went on a boat. He was a fairly wealthy farmer. It wasn't every farmer in Ireland was able to get in a boat and go buy sheep from Spain, but he got on a ship from Waterford to Cadiz, and the ship was wrecked off the coast of Cadiz. And the story goes that he was rescued by another ship, and the captain took him on board and brought him back to his own home. And sure, by pure chance, didn't this captain have some beautiful daughters? This is a movie waiting to happen. And anyway, William Garvey. He's in the captain's house, and doesn't he fall in love with one of the daughters? And the sheep are gone out of his mind at this stage. So he stays with the daughter. Forget the sheep, he says. I'll take the daughter instead. And he marries the daughter of the captain, and he sets himself up he fancies his chance as a wine merchant in Jerez. And so he starts this wine merchant business. He also starts buying up vineyards in Jerez. Now, the kind of footnote to the story is he eventually sends home a few sheep, kind of like, I'm staying, here's a few sheep, good luck to you. And anyway, his son took over from him, and his son turned this bodega into the largest bodega that exists in Jerez today. And it is, so great Irish connections. The Irishmen go overseas, fall in love with a foreigner, and start the biggest bodega in Spain. That is a Disney movie waiting to happen.
Send an email in the morning.
What's her name? Sherry. What other sherries? Yes, Manzanilla. We couldn't find any. I can't find a single Irish whiskey that has been aged in a Manzanilla cask.
I find this really hard to believe that someone has not done this yet. My money is on Middleton, in particular Method of Madness, because they're very innovative and out there with their releases in cask profiles and finishes.
Or the Iberian series.
Yes, true. Or Brendan Carty of Cologne. That's where my money is.
Somebody's doing it anyway. Somebody's surely doing it.
Someone had. Oh, there's no way out of, especially the older distilleries, Middleton, Bushmills. There has to be a Manzanilla cask in the back of the warehouse somewhere. There has to be.
There has to be.
There has to be. There's no way every other style of sherry's been used apart from that.
Yeah. Fino, you're drinking this one tonight.
I am. Yes. Right here.
I have not seen any other Irish whiskey aged in Fino casks.
No, me neither. Me neither.
So that's a real exclusive. That's a real exclusive.
More ways than one.
Which is extraordinary. That's an astonishing get that we have there.
Absolutely.
Muscatel. So we're getting into the sweeter ones now. So we left the dry behind. Now we're on to the first of the sweet sherries. Where can we find Muscatel? We can find that in the Liberator. They have their malt and Muscatel release. Boan Whistler has a release that involves Muscatel. Tyrconnell has an Oloroso and Muscatel release. And Fercullen has a Muscatel release as well. So you're moved into the sweeter kind of category of things now. Again, it's produced in much smaller quantities than Palomino. And the Palomino grape that gives us the Fino and the Manzanilla. And the Oloroso. So we're likely to see less of it. But when you're looking for a sweet grape or a sweet sherry, this is where you'll find them.
One of my favorite whiskies of all time is the 2008 Muscatel Causeway Collection.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Great whiskey. Graham's actually just made a very good point. Manzanilla is a saline sherry. So because it's primarily from San Lucar, which is a more coastal region, it does have that sort of salinity. So that's actually a very good point. It could be why it maybe just doesn't work.
It's true. Yeah. Good point.
Yeah.
Good point. Yeah. What have we missed on this kind of whistle stop overview of sherry? Like from my perspective, we couldn't hit on something more fascinating, adjacent to the world of Irish whiskey and involved in the world of Irish whiskey than sherry.
Exactly. Like the whiskey industry wouldn't be what it is without the use of sherry casks. And as much as you genuinely could probably take a full shebeen for each of the topics, for the history, the production, the styles, everything. I think we've covered it pretty well. Given that it's such a complex thing to dive into. Like Barry, we were both during the week listening to sherry podcasts about sherry, reading articles about sherry, and you really do need to concentrate to get your head around it, but in the best possible way. It's fascinating, and it gives you, for me anyway, especially when I've been drinking through these three whiskies, I'm on the 80-20 now, the PX finish, thinking about the sherry and how it's produced gives you much more of an appreciation of the whiskey.
Daniel mentions Redbreast Listau there. He says, pretty sure that's a Manzanilla finish. No, that's an Oloroso finish, but it's an interesting one to focus on because we didn't really focus on that specifically, which we maybe should have. So Redbreast Listau is a great celebration of the relationship between Irish distilleries and Spanish bodegas. And Bodegas Listau has had a long relationship with the Middleton Distillery, and Oloroso seasoned casks come from there all the time. The Redbreast Listau is unique in that it doesn't have the full 12 years of maturation in just bourbon and Oloroso separately. It has about 9 years of maturation separately as separate components that are then married together in ratios they don't tell us, but we suspect it's about 75% bourbon, 25% Oloroso. And then that married whiskey, which is now 9 years old and a vatting of the two different components, is put into a fresh Oloroso sherry cask from the Bodegas Listau for a further year of maturing. And then that gives us the very, like I find that a wonderfully vibrant whiskey. Like I find Listau more vibrant and exciting than Redbreast 12. I drink Listau before I drink Redbreast 12. It's brighter, it's more orange peel. I really, really like it. Yeah, really like it.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I had it for the first time a few weeks back for the first time in a long time, and I kind of was reminded of just how beautiful and how kind of dynamic it is. A few kind of the big bodegas. I guess we didn't really touch upon that too much, but Listal is a great one. Barbadillo is another really big one. Tio Pepe is another big one. It's probably the most, I'd say it's the most famous. I would say it definitely is the most famous. Or Diaz Merito is another one. There's a good few out there, but yeah, Tio Pepe and Listal were probably the two most recognizable names in the sherry and whiskey world.
Some of the older aged sherries can last for a long time. Younger sherries, Finos and Manzanillas, typically not. Like when you open a bottle of that, you got to drink it that night.
Yeah.
Like you open it, it's gone, right? And I think the advice we got during the week was you can't be buying a bottle of Fino or Manzanilla that's got dust on it, or you're in trouble.
Exactly, and you can't be putting it in the fridge either.
No, you can't. Cian said that Celtic Whiskey Shop have a Manzanilla aging. I'd say Celtic have everything under the sun aging all over the country. I'd say there's nothing they haven't got for their Celtic cask series, for their
That's great to know, actually, that it's more than likely going to appear at some point.
Any idea what proportion of Irish whiskey is currently matured in sherry and bourbon? What number would you put on that now, Lauren?
So percentage of bourbon casks versus sherry?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great question. I want to say bourbon is still higher.
Oh, yeah.
Bourbon's oh God. Would it be 60-40?
90-10.
Or 70-30?
90-10. 90-10.
Do you think so?
Easily. Yeah. Easily.
I want to believe there's more sherry, but I know there's not.
So if you just take Jameson alone, just to work it out.
True. Yeah.
So Jameson alone is a bourbon and sherry cask maturation, but Jameson is let's say it's a 92% grain to 8% pot still, and that might be generous. It could be 94.6 or 95.5.
Yeah.
So you don't put grain whiskey into a sherry cask because it'll destroy the grain.
Exactly.
So you put grain whiskey into a bourbon barrel, which means that 95% of all Jameson had to age in bourbon barrels. And you take the fact that Jameson itself is 120 million bottles every year and 85% of the Irish whiskey market.
Yeah.
That would be my kind of working out of it anyway.
And even when you think, even look at Bushmills Original and Tullamore Dew as well. They're the same kind of direction. Right. You know, bourbon aged, very, very high volume, high selling whiskies. Yeah, I want to believe it's 70-30, but I think you're right. I want to believe there's more sherry, but I know there's not.
You hear a lot on tours, people saying, they asked the question, the tour guide asked the question, why do you think there's not enough sherry casks or there's kind of there's not as many sherry casks as we might want? And people normally don't have the answer. And then the next question is, when was the last time any of you drank sherry? And everyone's like, oh, never. But that's not really the right answer, because it doesn't matter whether we drink it or not. We're not using transportation barrels we haven't for the last 40 years. So it's kind of a cutesy story. But I remember Mark Rainier from Waterford, like when he was on the lock-in a couple of years ago, he was railing against the use of sherry casks in Irish whiskey today. And he said, what are we, nuts? He said, why are we trying to recreate a system that no longer exists? He said, if that vehicle or kind of process disappeared, then we have to move on to what's available to us. And he said, like, trying to season sherry casks for use in Irish whiskey is kind of, it's not authentic. It's not real. You're getting flavor in ways that you could argue it has nothing to do with Irish whiskey at all. They're not shipping any sherry to Ireland, blah, blah, blah. So he doesn't use sherry casks in Waterford. I think it's an interesting argument. Like I like fortified wine infused whiskies. So yeah, I don't think I'd probably agree, but it does make for an interesting discussion.
Definitely. No, I'm the same. I would be the same as you. Like sherry finishes, fortified wine finishes. I think all of my favorite whiskeys are a fortified wine finish, to be honest. Like, yeah, the majority I own are probably sherry finishes. I would say that I wouldn't say always though. I've just literally thought about the whiskies we've tried very recently, like the Bushmills New American Oak. Like
Yeah,
it's an amazing whiskey.
yeah,
So
yeah. That's right.
there is a fight to be had for New American Oak and bourbon casks, but I think I'd still edge towards the old sherry.
This was a great learning experience for us too, and I think it was the first time I finally got my head around the whole floor thing, and like you and I, we went, like you said, we went into all kinds of podcasts, articles, research this deep, and I think we both arrived at, now we got the floor figured out.
Yeah.
It's tricky.
And it is, and there's so many. There's even when we were kind of piecing together tonight as well, there's so many sections that you could talk about in more than one section, and it's kind of like to help people understand where is the best place to put it, you know.
I know. We'll do one on port, and then maybe we'll do one on the other fortified wines, the Malaga, the Marsala, the Madeira. All interesting stories, all great histories, and all purely geographic. Very 100% dependent on where they come from, as opposed to just how they're made. I think we've covered it all with Sherry, Lorena. Muchas gracias por tu cooperación esta noche.
De nada, Bartolomeo.
Mañana.
Go on.
Tenemos un gran releacio. Espero que mañana mis amigos van a comprar esos botellas de whisky irlandés, 2 botellas pot still whisky irlandés de W.D. O'Connell, 5 años cada botella. All right, we'll leave it at that. Tomorrow we are releasing 2 whiskies. One of them is part matured in an amontillado cask that we talked about tonight, and one is part aged in a peat cask that formerly contained a single malt whiskey called Bill Phil, a peated whiskey from W.D. O'Connell. 2 remarkable whiskies. Tasting notes can be found in our Facebook community, on our Stories and Sips Facebook page, and all details of this website, of these whiskey releases, can be found on our website, storiesandsips.com. I want you to buy these, folks, to see the difference in the distillates thanks to the maturations. As I say every time we announce that our whiskies are for sale, do not go into financial difficulty to purchase whiskey. It is not worth it. There will be more whiskies, but we're making these available to you. And if they sit on the shelf, they'll sit on the shelf and be available for you whenever you want them. But looking forward to getting these out to you tomorrow. Our bundles, 150 bundles, are made up with swag and glassware and stickers and coasters and whiskey samples as well. And then we have individual bottles if you just want to order individual bottles as well. Sinead, I think that is, everything. Sinead, so we've done Irish, English, and Spanish now today.
Sorry, I'm just laughing at some of the comments. David saying he's going to get his bilingual son to translate all of this for him. Johnny's asking if you're going to sing the Four Seasons Sherry. Mark's also said, are we going to speak Portuguese during the port discussion? We draw the line. Anything else we're saying? Spanish and English.
I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to learn Portuguese if you give me enough time just for that.
Well, we could try an introduction and maybe an outro, and we'll see how it goes from there. Actually,
one of the distillers in Middleton, she's Angela. She's a Portuguese speaker. I'll get her to give me an overview of how to introduce the port section when we do it.
Duolingo. Very good point, Mark.
We will be not introducing any Chinese whiskies over the next few weeks. We'll be avoiding that.
might need to be a few behind the scenes lessons for that level of complexity.
Folks, thanks everybody for your support. Hope tonight was informative. Let us know if it was. I think we shared a lot. I think I've learned a lot. Whether it's of any interest to you or not, you can tell us, but me and Lauren liked it anyway. And if you did enjoy that, we'll do more like this as well going forward.
I agree, absolutely. Thank you always, everyone, for your support and tuning in to us two lunatics trying to educate you and drink some whiskey.
Sinead, and we'll see you online tomorrow for those who are involved in the Stories and Sips Whiskey Club, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening. So Sláinte, everybody. We'll say goodnight to you.
Everyone. Adios.
Adios. Hasta luego.